Marcus Reed was a well-respected lawyer, known for his sharp mind and dedication to justice. He had spent years working hard, earning his place in the legal world. One evening, after a long day in court, he was driving home in his luxury sedan. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his briefcase resting on the passenger seat. The city lights flickered past as he thought about the cases he had worked on that day. He was tired but satisfied with his work. As he drove through a quiet neighborhood, he noticed the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. A police car was right behind him. He frowned, confused. He had been driving within the speed limit, obeying all traffic rules. Still, he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down his window. Two police officers, Officer Daniels and Officer Miller, stepped out of the patrol car. Their faces were stern as they approached his vehicle. Marcus kept his hands on the steering wheel, just as he had always advised his clients to do in such situations. He knew the law, and he knew his rights. "License and registration," Officer Daniels said, his voice firm. Marcus remained calm as he reached for his wallet and handed over his documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked politely. The officers exchanged a glance before Officer Miller spoke. "We got a report about a suspicious vehicle in the area," he said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? I'm just driving home from work." Instead of responding, the officers began questioning him aggressively. "Where are you coming from? What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Marcus took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "I just told you, I'm heading home. I work as a lawyer downtown." The officers didn't seem to believe him. They glanced at each other again, as if silently deciding their next move. Then, without warning, Officer Daniels asked him to step out of the vehicle. Marcus knew he had done nothing wrong, but he also knew that refusing could escalate the situation. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, keeping his hands visible. The officers patted him down roughly, making a show of searching him. "This is unnecessary," Marcus said, trying to stay calm. "I haven't broken any laws. Just doing our job," Officer Miller said. Then, to Marcus's shock, Officer Daniels pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Turn around," he ordered. Marcus felt a wave of frustration. "Am I being arrested? What's the charge?" The officers didn't answer. Instead, they cuffed his wrists and led him toward their patrol car. As they placed him in the back seat, Marcus's heart pounded. He had spent years defending people in court, but now he was the one in trouble, for no reason at all. He stared out the window as the car drove away, wondering how the very system he believed in could be so unfair. Marcus sat in the back of the police car, his hands still cuffed behind him. The cold metal pressed against his wrists, but he stayed quiet, knowing that arguing would not help. He stared out the window as the city lights blurred past, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. The officers in the front seat didn't speak to him as they drove. Every now and then, Officer Daniels glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but Marcus kept his face calm. He wanted to ask again why they had arrested him, but he knew they wouldn't give him a real answer. Instead, he took a deep breath and reminded himself that he knew the law better than they did. When they arrived at the police station, the officers led him inside. The bright lights and the strong smell of disinfectant filled the air. Other officers and staff moved around, barely looking at him. This was just another routine arrest for them. Marcus was taken to a desk where an officer started the booking process. "Name?" the officer asked, not even looking up from the computer. "Marcus Reed." The officer typed in his name, then paused as if the name sounded familiar. But before he could say anything, Officer Daniels handed over Marcus's wallet and ID. "Just put him through," Daniels said quickly. The officer nodded and continued. Marcus was then asked to take off his belt, his tie, and his watch. They took his fingerprints, pressing his fingers down onto an ink pad before rolling them onto a piece of paper. The process felt surreal to him. He had been inside police stations before, but always as a lawyer, never like this. Afterward, the officers led him to a holding cell. It was a small, cold room with metal benches along the walls. The door shut behind him with a loud clang, and for the first time, Marcus truly felt the weight of the situation. He sat down, resting his hands on his knees. The air was heavy with silence, except for the occasional sound of distant voices and footsteps in the hallway. He had spent years defending people who had been wrongfully arrested, and now he was experiencing it firsthand. Time passed slowly. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there when he heard footsteps approaching. The cell door opened, and Officer Miller stood there with a smirk. "You're quiet. Not so tough now, are you?" Miller said. Marcus met his gaze without fear. "I know my rights," he replied calmly. "And I know this arrest is illegal." Miller just chuckled. "Yeah, well, good luck proving that." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew that the moment he made his phone call, everything would change. Marcus sat in the cold holding cell, his mind racing. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice, yet here he was, sitting behind bars for no reason. He knew the law. He knew his rights. And most importantly, he knew this wouldn't last long. But that didn't make the situation any less frustrating. A few minutes later, an officer walked up to the cell. "You get one phone call," he said, unlocking the door just long enough for Marcus to step out. Marcus stretched his hands, feeling the stiffness in his wrists from the handcuffs. He followed the officer to a phone mounted on the wall. The officer stood nearby, watching him closely, as if expecting him to cause trouble. Marcus picked up the receiver and dialed a number he knew by heart. The phone rang once, twice. Then a deep, steady voice answered. "This is David Carter." Marcus exhaled, relief washing over him. David was not just his best friend. He was also one of the top defense attorneys in the city. If anyone could fix this, it was him. "David," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm, "I need you to come to the station. Now." There was a pause. Then David's tone sharpened. "What happened?" Marcus explained briefly. The wrongful traffic stop. The baseless arrest. The way the officers had ignored everything, he said. David didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way," he said. "Sit tight." Marcus hung up the phone and turned to the officer. "I'll be out of here soon," he said confidently. The officer just shrugged and led him back to the cell. "We'll see," he muttered before locking the door again. Marcus sat down, feeling a new sense of determination. He wasn't just going to walk out of here. He was going to make sure these officers were held accountable. Time crawled by. Every minute felt like an hour. But then, finally, Marcus heard voices outside his cell. The door swung open, and in walked David, dressed in his usual sharp suit. Behind him, the station's commanding officer followed, looking tense. David didn't waste time. "Marcus Reed should not be in this cell," he said firmly. "Release him. Now." Officer Daniels and Officer Miller, who had been standing nearby, suddenly looked uncomfortable. They had assumed Marcus was just another person they could dismiss, but now they realized he had powerful connections. The commanding officer cleared his throat. "We're reviewing the situation," he said. David crossed his arms. "There's nothing to review. Either you release him now, or I'll make sure this entire department is under investigation by morning." The room fell silent. Then, reluctantly, the officer gave a nod. "Let him out." The cell door clicked open. Marcus stood up, straightening his suit. He looked at Daniels and Miller, their confident expressions now replaced with uncertainty. As he stepped out, he spoke calmly. "This isn't over." And he meant it. Weeks had passed since Marcus's wrongful arrest, but the incident had not been forgotten. His legal team had filed complaints, and the case had gained attention in legal circles. Marcus, being a respected lawyer, had many supporters who were outraged by what had happened. He had chosen not to let the incident make him angry. Instead, he focused on what he did best, fighting for justice. One morning, As Marcus prepared for his usual court hearings, he received an interesting case assignment. A misconduct case had been filed against 2 officers accused of wrongful arrests and harassment. He read through the case file, and the names made him pause. Officer Daniels, Officer Miller. A slow smile formed on Marcus's face. Life had an interesting way of bringing things full circle. These were the same officers who had arrested him for no reason. And now, they were about to stand in his courtroom, facing charges for their actions. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Lawyers, reporters, and members of the public filled the seats. This case had drawn attention, as many people were eager to see if the officers would be held accountable. Marcus took his place at the judge's bench, dressed in his official black robe. The courtroom fell silent as he sat down. Then, the doors opened, and Officers Daniels and Miller walked in. They looked confident at first, expecting the usual process. But then, their eyes landed on Marcus. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Their faces drained of color. Their confident strides slowed. Their expressions turned to shock. Marcus kept his face calm, but inside, he saw everything. The realization, the regret, the sudden fear in their eyes. They had thought they were in control that night. They had treated him as if he were beneath them. But now, they stood before him, not as officers with power, but as defendants in a court of law. The courtroom remained silent as Marcus picked up his gavel. He tapped it once, his voice steady and firm. "Let's begin." The officers hesitated before taking their seats. Their lawyer looked nervous, fumbling with papers as he prepared to defend them. Marcus looked at the case files in front of him. This wasn't just about him. Other people had come forward with similar complaints. Daniels and Miller had a history of using their authority unfairly. Now, the evidence was in front of the court, and justice would take its course. As the hearing began, Marcus remained professional. He did not let personal feelings interfere. But one thing was clear: the officers who once had power over him now had no control at all. They had laughed at him in that holding cell. Now they sat in his courtroom, facing the consequences of their actions. Justice had come full circle. Officer Daniels and Officer Miller sat stiffly in their seats, their hands clasped together as they tried to hide their nervousness. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in. Just weeks ago, they had arrested Marcus Reed without cause, treating him as if he were just another ordinary citizen they could push around. But now, they were in his courtroom, not as officers but as defendants. Marcus sat tall in his judge's chair, his expression calm and unreadable. He had spent years mastering the art of controlling emotions in the courtroom. He was not here for revenge. He was here for justice. The officer's lawyer, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, cleared his throat and stood up. "Your Honor, my clients." He hesitated, glancing at Daniels and Miller before continuing. "My clients have served in law enforcement for years. They were simply doing their job on the night in question." Marcus folded his hands together and looked directly at the lawyer. "And what job was that exactly?" he asked. His voice was steady, but there was an undeniable weight behind it. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. They were responding to a call about a suspicious vehicle. Marcus raised an eyebrow. A vehicle that belonged to a lawyer, driving home from work. The lawyer opened his mouth but hesitated. He knew there was no real defense. The truth was already out in the open. The prosecution team then began presenting their case. Security camera footage was shown to the courtroom, capturing the moments of the wrongful arrest. The footage clearly showed Marcus calmly complying with the officers while they aggressively escalated the situation. Witnesses, including other drivers who had been stopped by the same officers, testified about similar experiences. Some spoke about being treated unfairly. Others shared how they had been arrested for no clear reason. With each passing minute, Daniels and Miller seemed to shrink further in their seats. The weight of their past actions was coming back to them, and there was nowhere to hide. When it was their turn to speak, Officer Daniels cleared his throat. Your Honor, we made a mistake that night, he admitted, his voice quieter than before. We didn't realize who you were. Marcus leaned forward slightly. And if I had not been a judge? He asked, his eyes locked onto the officer. Daniels had no answer. His silence spoke louder than any words could. The courtroom remained still, everyone waiting for what would happen next. Marcus tapped his gavel lightly against the desk. This case is not about who I am, he said. It is about fairness. It is about the responsibility that comes with wearing a badge. Daniels and Miller looked down at their hands. They had spent years feeling untouchable, believing they would never face consequences. But now, they knew the truth. No one is above the law. And justice was about to be served. The courtroom was silent as Marcus took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. The evidence had been presented, the witnesses had spoken, and the truth was clear. Officers Daniels and Miller had abused their power, not just on the night they arrested him, but on multiple occasions before. This was not a one-time mistake. It was a pattern of behavior. And now, the law they once used against others was about to hold them accountable. The officers sat stiffly, their faces tense. They had come into the courtroom expecting a routine hearing, maybe even a slap on the wrist. But as the case unfolded, their confidence had faded. The weight of their actions had become undeniable. The prosecutor stood and delivered the final argument. Your Honor, these officers had a duty to serve and protect. Instead, they used their authority to target innocent people. Their actions have damaged public trust in law enforcement. This court must send a clear message. No one is above the law. The defense lawyer stood up, looking uncertain. Your Honor, my clients regret their actions. They have served the community for years. I ask that the court show leniency. Marcus listened carefully, his face calm but serious. He understood the responsibility of his position. This was not about personal revenge. It was about fairness. He picked up his gavel and spoke in a firm, steady voice. This court has reviewed all evidence and testimony, he said. The law is clear. Officers Daniels and Miller are guilty of misconduct and wrongful arrest. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Some people nodded in agreement. Others watched the officers closely, waiting for their reaction. Marcus continued. This is not just about one case. Multiple complaints have been filed against you both. You have misused your authority, and today, you face the consequences. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their hands clasped together. They had spent years believing they were untouchable. Now, that illusion was shattered. Marcus looked directly at them. As officers, you took an oath to uphold the law. Instead, you used it as a weapon against those who had done nothing wrong. Because of your repeated actions, you will lose your badges, and your records will reflect your misconduct. A heavy silence filled the room. Daniels and Miller looked at each other, their faces pale. Losing their badges meant losing everything: their careers, their authority, and their reputation. Marcus tapped his gavel once. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in whispers as people processed what had just happened. Reporters scribbled notes, and members of the public exchanged glances. Justice had been served. As the officers were let out, Marcus watched them go. He felt no anger, only a sense of responsibility. This wasn't about punishing them. It was about making sure they could never misuse their power again. He stood up and left the courtroom, knowing that today, the system had worked the way it was meant to. The news of the court ruling spread quickly, sparking widespread discussion. The case involving officers Daniels and Miller became a turning point in the ongoing conversation about police misconduct and racial profiling. Across the city, people talked about what had happened, how the very system that had wronged Marcus Reed had now held two officers accountable for their actions. For Marcus, the courtroom victory was satisfying, but it wasn't the end of his journey. It was only the beginning. He had always been committed to justice, but now, more than ever, he felt the weight of his position. The victory in court was important, but it needed to be a catalyst for change. As reporters asked for his comments in the days following the trial, Marcus used every opportunity to speak out about the need for reform. He talked about how this wasn't just about one case or two officers. It was about a system that allowed bad behavior to continue unchecked for far too long. He emphasized the importance of holding all law enforcement accountable, not just the ones who got caught. His words resonated with many. People reached out to him with stories of their own encounters with law enforcement, some with similar experiences of racial profiling, others with stories of unfair treatment. Marcus listened carefully to each one, offering support and advice where he could. At the same time, the police department was under pressure. The story had gone national, and people were demanding answers. How many other officers had behaved like Daniels and Miller? How many had used their position of power to intimidate and harass people without consequence? Internal investigations were launched. The department had to answer tough questions, and several officers came under scrutiny for similar actions. For many, it was a wake-up call. The media attention also led to more calls for policy changes. Marcus became an advocate for police reform, using his platform to push for more oversight and accountability. He worked with other community leaders, organizing forums and town halls where people could voice their concerns and share their experiences. While the officers who had wrongfully arrested Marcus were facing the consequences of their actions, the larger question of reform was just beginning. Marcus knew that it wasn't enough to punish a few bad actors. Real change had to come from within the system itself. In the weeks that followed, Marcus spoke at rallies, attended meetings with lawmakers, and became an outspoken figure in the fight for justice. He was no longer just a judge. He was a symbol of resilience and fairness, a reminder that one person's voice could make a difference. At the same time, Daniels and Miller were left to grapple with the fallout of their actions. Their once promising careers were over, and they found themselves in a world that no longer looked at them with respect. They had underestimated Marcus, and now they understood the true weight of their choices. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus remained focused. He knew that even though the officers had been convicted, the fight for equality and justice was ongoing. The road to change would be long, but it was a road he was determined to walk. And with each step, he hoped to make the world a little more just for everyone. As months passed, Marcus continued to feel the impact of the case, not just on the legal community, but on his personal life as well. He had expected his life to return to some sense of normalcy after the trial, but things had changed. People now recognized him everywhere he went, not just as a lawyer or judge, but as a symbol of change. The case had touched something deep in the hearts of many people, and they saw Marcus as someone who stood up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Despite the new attention, Marcus remained focused on his work. He continued to serve as a judge, his courtroom still filled with the usual mix of cases. But every so often, he would pause and think back to that night. The night he had been wrongfully arrested. It had been a traumatic experience, but it had also pushed him to take action in ways he hadn't imagined. It made him realize how important it was to use his position for more than just enforcing the law. It was about creating change, not just within the courtroom, but within the community. One afternoon, Marcus received an invitation to speak at a national conference on police reform. It was a huge honor, and while he had spoken at smaller events, this would be his chance to speak on a larger stage. The invitation came from a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving police accountability, and they wanted him to share his story, not just as a victim, but as someone who was actively working toward creating a fairer system for everyone. The day of the conference arrived, and Marcus stood before a packed auditorium. He looked out at the sea of faces, many of whom were law enforcement officials, activists, and community leaders. He felt a surge of nervous energy, but quickly reminded himself that this moment wasn't just about him. It was about making the world a better place. He began by telling his story, the one that everyone had heard by now, the wrongful arrest, the humiliation, and the long road to justice. But this time, he focused less on the details and more on the lessons he had learned along the way. He spoke about the importance of holding the powerful accountable, of ensuring that everyone, no matter their race, background, or profession, was treated fairly under the law. As I sat in that holding cell, he said, his voice steady, I realized something. It wasn't just about me. It was about the thousands of people who face injustice every single day. It was about the people who can't afford a lawyer, who don't have the resources to fight back. My experience was painful, yes, but it was a reminder that we must keep pushing for fairness, for equality, for justice. The audience sat in rapt attention as Marcus continued, sharing his vision for a future where the system truly protected everyone. He talked about the need for better training for officers, for more oversight, and for a community-based approach to law enforcement that emphasized de-escalation and understanding. As he finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. It was clear that Marcus's words had struck a chord. People who had been on the fence about reform were now thinking about it differently. His experience had turned into a powerful call to action, one that extended beyond his personal story to a larger movement for change. That night, as Marcus stood in front of a crowd of supporters, shaking hands and receiving praise, he realized how far he had come. The journey that had started with one wrongful arrest had turned into something far greater, an opportunity to be part of something bigger than himself. And while the road ahead was still long, Marcus knew he was on the right path.